happy days are here again. The skies above are clear.
Welcome back. Today's video is on the second New Deal of FDR. So you already did the heavy lifting with the first New Deal. There's a lot more programs to know. You talked about the first 100 days, talked about the bank holiday, FDIC, SEC, AAA, CCC, TVA, PWA, CWA. This video is much simpler. You'll have to know the Social Security Act, the WPA, the Wagner Act, and ultimately that there are critiques of FDR and his New Deal, and he will somewhat address them. A hallmark of the first New Deal was deficit spending. The government was spending way more on work programs and whatnot than it was taking in income taxes and tariffs. FDR will keep this going. And he does question it at one point, thinking maybe balancing the budget would be important. But he reads the work of British economist John Maynard Keynes, who suggests the government's responsibility in an economic downturn is to deficit spend, is to pump more money into unemployment or trying to get people employed, to cut taxes, to try to stimulate spending. These are things the government should do. So what is FDR dumping all this money on in the second New Deal?
The Works Progress Administration was launched late in 1935 as the key agency in the federal work program to employ able people from relief roles.
$11 billion will be spent on the Works Progress Administration from 1935 to 1942 alone. But the payoff will be huge. 8.5 million Americans will be employed by the WPA. So they'll do the infrastructure, they'll do the roads and the bridges and the dams again, but it's also going to be funding artists and writers and photographers and musicians and teachers and scholars to do what they do best as well. For example, you've got community concerts put on, community theater, you have seminars. A much broader scope of things are being directly funded by the federal government through the WPA. Does it pay well to work for the WPA? Well, kind of, sort of. So you're making 2 times that of what the relief payments would have been if you were out of work, but at the same rate, you aren't making as much as a typical worker. There's a really neat site. It's called The Living New Deal, and they have put most of these projects that were funded by the WPA, but also like the CCC and the CWA and other work projects. Pretty cool site. The QR code there should take you to it if you're interested. But you can see here, Swallow Cliff was built by the CCC specifically. A monumental victory for workers during the second New Deal is the Wagner Act, or the National Labor Relations Act. And this is passed in 1935. The main things it does is protect unions forming. So unions are protected. You could join a union. Prior to this, you could be blacklisted, or employers could do all sorts of things to try to make you leave that union or prevent you from joining it in the first place. Union membership was around 3 million prior to this Wagner Act. After the Wagner Act, we're going to see union membership rise to about 10 million Americans by 1940. The Wagner Act also makes collective bargaining completely legitimate. So this is where a union is going to have some representatives that go to the boss, go to the employer, and on the behalf of the union members are going to compromise and negotiate. The National Labor Relations Board is created as well in order to further investigate unfair practices of employers on their labor. During the second New Deal, you're also going to see Social Security created.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 millions of our citizens who will reap direct benefits through unemployment compensation, through old age pensions, and through increased services for the protection of children and the prevention of ill health.
It's still around today, but it gets its start in 1935. The Social Security Administration's main objective was to help the poor elderly who should have been retired, but when banks failed in the 1930s, they lost everything. So instead of them having to go back to work, perhaps they're even maybe disabled at this point and can't go back to work. If you were 65 or older, Social Security would pay you a monthly check to help make ends meet. Now, It also extends to anyone who's disabled. So you could be younger than 65, but be blind, for example, and Social Security would kick in to help you out. It also extended to dependents of a spouse that may have passed. So if you're a widow or you are a child that depended on, a working dad, you would be covered by Social Security and be getting these checks. How would this system be paid for? Well, you'll notice when you get a job that a little bit of money is taken out for Social Security in each paycheck. At the time in 1935, the rate was about 1% of the first $3,000 of annual wage a person made, and then the company matched it with another 1%. So this would then go into a pool of funds that Social Security would dole out in these retirement paychecks. So FDR is taking a lot of criticism at the time, and the conservative right is saying that he is creating a limited welfare state. He's verging on socialism, and the left is criticizing him in that he's not doing enough. He's not helping the elderly enough, the poor enough, minorities enough, unemployed people enough. So to go into a little bit more detail, let me introduce Huey Long. He was a governor of Louisiana and then the senator of Louisiana, and he believed that FDR wasn't doing enough to help with income inequality in America. So he promoted a Share Our Wealth program, which the idea here was to tax the wealthiest Americans a lot more and then use that revenue to make sure that every American family had at least $2,000 of annual income. It also included universal health care for all, free higher education for young people, and pensions for the elderly. Huey Long would have been a very legitimate contender to FDR in the 1936 presidential election had he survived to see it. He is assassinated in September of 1935. Another of these demagogues is a Catholic priest from Detroit named Father Charles Coughlin. Now, Father Coughlin had a radio show that got very popular, and he used this mass media avenue to get a huge following, and people are listening to what he has to say. He's an interesting one because he critiques FDR originally from a very leftist viewpoint, saying FDR could have gone and should have gone further to help with unemployment and to help the poor out and help minorities out. What you will see happen is somewhere in the mid-1930s, Coughlin starts to shift those views and does the polar opposite, complaining that FDR is pushing the country down a socialist path. And on top of that, he starts to take on this fascist rhetoric and anti-Semitism. So by 1939, Coughlin will be pressured by Catholic Church leaders to abandon his radio show. Another of these demagogues is a former physician named Dr. Francis E. Townsend. Townsend is going to critique the New Deal on not doing enough for the elderly. He proposes the Townsend Plan, which is to do a 2% tax nationally on all products and use that new income to the federal government to give elderly citizens over 60 years old a $200 check every month. There is a stipulation to it, though. The $200 has to be spent within that month, otherwise it's gone. So theoretically, this would help the elderly make ends meet in retirement, but also help stimulate the economy because now they're forced to spend this $200 every month, buying things and propping up the economy. FDR steals Townsend's idea, though, and that becomes Social Security, essentially. Another criticism of the New Deal is that it did not do enough for minorities. So let's take African Americans, for example. Face value, the CCC looked great because it's hiring all these young men, and it did hire over 200,000 African American men. But on the CCC camps, they separated workers and segregated them in black and white camps. Another example is the Agricultural Adjustment Administration was cutting checks to farmers, but these checks were not making it to the sharecroppers and the tenant farmers who were African American. They were getting pocketed by the plantation owners or the owners of these farms, the landowners. Women, too, were often not directly prioritized in the work programs the government was making. Like, these were hiring people to build infrastructure. It was construction jobs, and a lot of times men were prioritized over women. The Supreme Court of the United States was also stepping on FDR's toes a little bit in that second New Deal phase. In 1935, they struck down the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, as unconstitutional. A year later, they struck down the AAA. FDR is so upset with the Supreme Court that he comes up with a scheme, a judicial reorganizing act that would allow him to appoint a replacement judge for each judge that is 70 and a half years old or older. There was a limit. He couldn't do more than 6 additional judges, so 15 judges total for the Supreme Court, but this enraged many American citizens and congressmen. It seemed like he was trying to meddle with the checks and balances of the judicial branch. However, in 1936 and 37, we start to see the Supreme Court shift and start to align with FDR. They support the Wagner Act. They uphold the WPA. Jokingly, that's called the switch in time that saved 9. So ultimately, we see FDR become more long-term in his scope of reform in his second New Deal phase. We have the Social Security Act being a perfect example of this. We also saw the Wagner Act to help labor unions and workers. We saw the creation of the WPA to create more jobs. And we did see some pushback against FDR's New Deal programs, but ultimately FDR responding to a few of those and pushing through the rest. All right, that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great one.